Coming from like a fitness perspective, like somewhat speculative, but it was like then somewhat validated where, okay, like, hey, like you finish your workout, like you're insulin sensitive, like now's the time to have your whey protein shake, just get a lean, easy protein.
Yeah.
So is there evidence even like post-workout that sans carbs, just having like some ground beef, some fat in it might actually get you more protein synthesis than say a whey protein shake?
Yeah. Well, so this study, I don't know. I can't remember the timing of it. Like, did they give it? I wish I could remember whether they gave it at a specific time, like within a certain window following the workout. I just can't recall. But the protein and the fat they used was egg. They used egg white alone, which is a very good protein. And then they used the whole egg. So the magic of an egg, in my mind, is that it's a 1-to-1 ratio of fat by mass to protein by mass. And that in that study, the whole egg consumption, so the fat and the protein together, was more anabolic than the protein alone. I don't know of comparable studies with, say, whey. Like if you have whey and then you add dairy fat, and I am an enormous advocate of dairy fat. I'm an advocate of all natural fats. I really am. But there's some nuance there where people need to appreciate that if you are asking a muscle cell to undergo hypertrophy, which is largely a function of the protein. So that's where the proteins come into play. That's where the amino acids come into play, particularly branched chain amino acids. They're helping build the structure of the interior of that muscle cell. But as the muscle cell is expanding, the membrane is primarily made of fat. And so if you're asking this muscle cell to get big and you're only providing it with the building blocks on the inside, what a pressure on the outside. So if you can be giving it some of these long chain fats that are now helping build the structure of the exterior, especially phospholipids, which are particularly loaded in animal fats, now you're also helping with the exterior of it, the membrane of it. You're allowing the membrane to continue to expand as we're demanding that the interior protein increase.
So is there not so much, and I'm asking honestly from my own personal, it's not uncommon. Like actually a lot of times, most of the time after a workout, I just don't even bother eating. Like I still stay fasted for a while because I'm not concerned. I think, I don't know, you've probably seen.
Oh, no, that's absolutely valid.
Like it's totally
Dr. Stuart Phillips, one of the leading authorities on muscle protein synthesis, and Luc Van Loon at Maastricht, also one of the absolute authorities, they've referred to protein as, rather than a window, it's like a barn door. Yeah, that really, as long as you're getting some adequate amount within a pretty broad range, then you're laughing.
I don't trip up about it at all, but it's interesting because, it's drilled into my head from even bodybuilding days in the past. It's like, okay, have your whey protein isolate. So you're not even getting the full spectrum of with water, not with milk. So, and it's like, now I'm almost thinking like, okay, maybe a whey protein concentrate with whole milk is better.
In fact, absolutely. That's what I would say. Now, of course, I would defer to a bodybuilder. That's not something I've ever experimented with. But particularly for the average individual who just wants to be healthy and strong and not worrying about getting to a 4% body fat, which from everything I understand is a miserable way to live. Yeah, like you talk to any of these bodybuilders, during their cutting phase, they are totally obsessed with one thing and one thing only, and it's food. Yeah. Like at any given moment, it's food that they're talking about and thinking about. But that to me is important. I hate to go off on a tangent,
no, for sure.
But when we invoke the same principles, like people who just say, eat just all protein and cut all other calories, that is the way the bodybuilder is going to be cutting. But those guys have an unnatural degree of discipline. These are guys who are used to just punishing their bodies and gritting their teeth and getting through whatever the trial is, including this constant obsession with food. When we take that same strategy and then give it to an overweight type 2 diabetic, well, no wonder it fails so often, because now you're asking them to work against hunger.
우리가 체중 감량을 위해 하는 운동과 식단은 보디빌딩 문화에서 비롯된 것들이 많습니다. 예를 들어 하루에 여러 번 나누어 식사하기, 닭가슴살 먹기, 계란 노른자는 버리고 흰자만 먹는 극단적인 저지방 식단, 운동 후 30분 이내에 단백질을 섭취하는 방식 등이 대표적입니다. 하지만 보디빌더들의 식단과 훈련 방식을 살펴보면 그들에게는 극단적으로 체지방을 낮추는 시즌기, 그리고 일정 수준의 체지방을 유지하면서 근육량을 늘리는 비시즌기가 있습니다. 따라서 매일의 일상을 살아가는 일반인이 보디빌더가 대회를 준비하기 위해 일시적으로 실천하는 방식을 그대로 따라가는 것은 적절치 않습니다. 보디빌딩의 목표는 건강이 아니라 시각적으로 완벽한 신체를 만드는 것입니다. 이 과정은 엄청난 절제가 요구되며 심지어 건강이 일부 희생되기도 합니다. 그런데도 많은 사람들이 이런 방식이 건강과 감량을 위한 최선의 방법이라고 오해하고 있습니다. 이러한 접근 방식을 일반인이 그대로 따라가면 비크먼 박사가 지적한 대로 여러 가지 문제가 발생할 수 있습니다. 칼로리와 지방을 극단적으로 제한하는 식단은 지속 가능성이 낮으며 식욕 조절이 어려워져 폭식으로 이어질 가능성이 큽니다. 저는 보디빌딩 자체를 비난하려는 것이 아닙니다. 다만 그들의 방식을 무조건 따라하기보다는 보디빌딩식 식단의 목적을 이해하고 자신의 건강과 생활 패턴에 맞게 조정하는 것이 필요하다는 점을 강조하고 싶습니다. 보디빌더들은 대회에 맞춰 신체를 조절하지만 우리는 장기적인 건강을 최우선적으로 고려해야 합니다. 따라서 필요 이상의 제한보다는 지속성을 고려한 식단 전략을 짜야 합니다. 그리고 단백질과 지방의 관계는 다른 영상에서는 거의 다뤄지지 않는 주제입니다. 다소 생소하고 이해하기 어려울 수 있는 내용을 벤 비크먼 박사는 과학적 배경 지식이 없이도 쉽게 이해할 수 있도록 설명하고 있습니다. 근육도 결국 세포입니다. 세포가 성장하려면 내부의 구성 성분만 증가하는 것이 아니라 외부를 둘러싸고 있는 세포막도 함께 커져야 합니다. 그리고 세포막의 주된 구성 성분은 인지질을 포함한 지방입니다. 즉, 세포가 성장하려면 세포막을 구성하는 지방이 충분히 공급되어야 한다는 점은 이론적으로 그리고 상식적으로 생각해봐도 매우 타당한 주장입니다. 이제 벤 비커먼 박사는 인슐린이 어떤 기전을 통해 체중 감량에 영향을 주는지 보다 깊이 있는 내용을 일반인도 쉽게 이해할 수 있도록 설명합니다.
If the dietary, back to the same ideas where I just outlined, I hope, convincingly that in order for a fat cell to grow, you need two components, elevated insulin and sufficient calories to fuel the growth that the insulin's signaling. Those same two variables then get turned down, of course, when you start to talk about how we shrink fat cells. But most people, and both are elevated. If a person's getting fatter and fatter, they have elevated insulin to signal the growth and sufficient calories to fuel the growth. Both of them need to be turned down. Unfortunately, the overwhelming conversation only focuses on one of those variables, which is the calories. So if you have an individual who begins cutting their calories, but they still have this underlying hyperinsulinemia, Dr. David Ludwig published a series of papers out of Harvard, which are beautiful, that look at the available amount of energy in the blood. And I referenced this earlier in our conversation. But if you are cutting calories, but insulin is still high, you are pushing all the calorie nutrients into the tissues. And that leaves a lower amount of calorie nutrients available in the blood. And the brain senses this. The brain has a limited capacity to store energy. And thus the brain says, hey, we're getting low on energy in the blood, because it can't sense what's stored in the fat or the liver directly, and so it starts to promote greater hunger. And so if a person's weight loss or fat cell shrinking journey starts with cutting calories, they're very quickly going to return right to where they started, because if they haven't addressed the high insulin, they're going to become very, very hungry. This is why when you look at these Biggest Loser game shows, you never see a reunion. Yeah. You never see them get back together because they gain it all back. So as much as calories matter, my strong advice is start with the low insulin approach. You just control your carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. Now, and don't worry about the calories, because if you correct your insulin, you will have a higher metabolic rate by about 200 to 300 calories a day just by lowering insulin. Calorie expenditure, metabolic rate will just go up. This is reflective of insulin is so good at telling the body to store energy that when it's absent or when it goes down, the body is spending it more readily than it would normally. So metabolic rate will go up, and then you will start wasting energy in the form of ketones. So if insulin is down, the person's burning a lot of fat because insulin controls which fuel is being used. And when insulin is down for an extended period of time, about 16 hours, the body is burning so much fat that the liver is actually burning more fat than it needs to meet its own energetic needs. So the liver is basically saying, hey, I don't need any more energy. But also the liver is saying, yeah, but I can't stop burning fat because insulin's low. That excess is what is turned into ketones. And then now what about the ketones? They have a caloric value. Every ketone has a caloric value roughly similar to glucose. And when a person's in ketosis, you are now directly eliminating those ketones from the breath and in the urine. Well, those are calories that, based on the typical view of thermodynamics, we would say, well, they have to be burned through exercise or stored, or they can just be wasted if insulin is low. So that represents another mechanism whereby a low insulin approach is very helpful for weight loss, because you are literally wasting energy. You're breathing these ketones out or you're urinating them out. And so eventually the person's going to lose a certain amount of weight by just addressing the insulin, not even counting calories. And then if they find that they get to a plateau, then I say, okay, now it's time to scrutinize calories. But the best way, in my view, to do that is through structured fasting rather than through kind of constant deprivation and this underlying hunger that comes with it. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but even still, it allows me to kind of bring in a lot of other points.
No,
벤 비크먼 박사의 설명을 통해 인슐린이 체중 감량에 어떤 영향을 미치는지 알아보았습니다. 결국 다이어트의 핵심은 인슐린을 어떻게 조절하느냐에 달려 있으며 간헐적 단식과 키토 식단은 인슐린을 낮출 수 있는 가장 효과적인 방법이라 할 수 있습니다. 많은 다이어터들이 바라는 아무것도 하지 않아도 살이 빠지는 몸 상태를 만들려면 우선 인슐린을 낮춰야 합니다. 이 점에서 비크먼 박사뿐만 아니라 우리 채널에서 소개한 많은 전문가들이 키토 식단을 실천할 때 지방 섭취가 아닌 탄수화물 제한을 우선적으로 강조하는 이유를 이해할 수 있습니다. 왜냐하면 인슐린 분비에 가장 큰 영향을 주는 영양소는 탄수화물이기 때문입니다. 그리고 이때는 음식의 질보다 양 자체에 집중하는 것이 더욱 효과적인 전략이 될 수 있습니다. 왜냐하면 많은 사람들이 건강한 음식이라면 먹는 양에 대해 긴장을 풀어버리는 경향이 있기 때문입니다. 예를 들어서 과자나 탄산음료는 먹으면 살이 찐다는 걸 알기 때문에 다이어트를 할 때 최대한 피하거나 조심해서 먹습니다. 반면 현미밥은 건강한 음식이라고 생각해 다이어트 중에도 큰 경계 없이 많이 먹기도 합니다. 그러나 현미의 식이섬유가 혈당과 인슐린 스파이크를 아주 약간 방어해줄 수는 있어도 결국 탄수화물 섭취량이 많아지면 살이 찌는 건 동일합니다. 즉 식이섬유가 많고 자연적인 음식이라 해도 결국 양 자체를 줄이지 않으면 인슐린 반응은 여전히 크며 지방 연소가 억제됩니다. 물론 탄수화물 양과 질 모두를 고려하면 가장 좋겠지만 다이어트를 시작하는 단계에서 모든 요소를 동시에 관리하기는 쉽지 않습니다. 그렇다면 우선 탄수화물의 양에 집중하는 것도 좋은 전략이 될 수 있습니다. 잠시 제 이야기를 하자면 저는 하루 약 70g 내외의 탄수화물을 섭취하고 있습니다. 이 범위 내에서는 밥도 먹고 떡도 먹고 과일도 먹습니다. 이 방법이 100% 이상적인 방식이라 할 수는 없지만 강한 절제를 하지 않아도 되기 때문에 식단을 유지함에 있어 아무런 스트레스가 없습니다. 욕구를 꾹 억누르고 있다가 갑자기 입이 터져버려서 폭식한다든지 하는 일도 생기지 않습니다. 이렇게 탄수화물의 질보다 양 조절에 집중하는 방식은 지나친 절제 없이 현실적인 범위에서 실천할 수 있다는 점에서 많은 분들에게 도움이 되는 방법이라고 생각합니다.
One last question on this, because this is if someone were to, let's say, basal metabolic rate of, I don't know, let's just say, just make it easy math, 2,000, and they were to eat, put themselves in a deficit down to 1,000 calories, but they only ate carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So insulin was spiked. Obviously, they would lose weight, but would they just retain fat mass and lose muscle mass?
Yeah, what a great question. So they would lose weight, but it would be relatively more lean mass than fat mass as a percent. Now, what you've done here is actually allow me to touch on a really important point, which is a lot of people will cite these low carb versus low fat studies. And they'll say, well, look at the degree of fat loss. It's always pretty close. Although, mind you, there has literally never been one single paper published finding that the low fat diet caused more statistically significant weight loss. Not one. Yeah. But there are several that show the low-carb diet having a significantly greater effect, but never one in the other direction. But even still, they will say, look at both of these studies, both of them lost weight, or both groups, low-carb versus low-fat. Yeah, but they're always low-calorie. That's the thing that people don't appreciate, is that you've taken someone eating a standard American diet, high-fat, high-carb, relatively high calorie. Even when you put them in the low fat group, you've cut their calories down. So they're eating less of everything now, even less glucose. And so it's not surprising that their insulin is also reduced. And so you always have this huge confounding variable. So just to finish that thought, and then I'll come back to the issue you brought up, the actual only way to truly declare a winner, whether low carb is better or low fat is better, is you have to see which one is more resistant to fat gain. So rather than doing these hypocaloric studies, what we have to do, and it's never been done ever, do a hypercaloric version of both diets. So you take a ketogenic, low carb, but matched with calories to a high carb, but they're both high calorie. And now let's see who gets fat less, if that makes sense. Now we can actually start to tease apart the difference between the insulin theory of obesity or the caloric theory of obesity. But if we take the average person and they're only eating glucose at 1,000 grams, 1,000 calories, they're probably still eating less overall than they clearly were than when they're eating. Yeah, so if they have let's just say they were eating 2,000 calories and they were weight stable. Yeah, insulin would still come down in that individual, and they may have an underlying a little bit of some bits of hyperglycemia, but I've not seen a study that's done this. I suspect if you compared that person to the person eating 1,000 calories of pure fat, the person eating the pure fat, let's say they both lose 10 pounds, but I bet as a percent of body fat, the fat eater is lost more fat because fat does not increase insulin at all. Anyone who says otherwise is looking at type 1 diabetes studies, and that's a very different metabolic milieu because of the underlying hyperglucagonemia, which changes the metrics a bit. But if you take a non-diabetic and they eat pure fat, there's no insulin spike whatsoever. This has been published for decades. I'm about to publish my own report looking at this exact same thing. So fat alone elicits no insulin spike, so that guy's going to have a higher metabolic rate. And because the insulin is low, he's going to be burning fat like gangbusters. The other guy who's eating 1,000 calories of glucose, he's still going to lose weight, of course, but I suspect that as a percent, he's losing a little more lean mass and preserving a little bit of fat mass.
비크먼 박사의 언급대로 많은 연구에서 저탄수화물 식단과 저지방 식단을 비교하며 칼로리를 동일하게 맞추면 체중 감량 효과는 비슷하다는 결론을 내놓습니다. 이는 단식과 저칼로리 식단을 비교하는 연구에서도 마찬가지인데요. 이러한 연구들은 단식의 효과를 평가절하하며 결국 다이어트는 칼로리 게임이다라는 주장을 강화하는 근거로 자주 사용됩니다. 하지만 이러한 연구에는 두 가지 중요한 한계점이 있습니다. 첫째, 연구기간이 단기적이라는 점입니다. 단기적인 체중 감량만을 고려한다면 연구기간 동안 아무것도 먹지 않는 것이 가장 효과적인 방법일 것입니다. 하지만 그것이 장기적인 감량 전략이 될 수 없다는 점은 모두가 알고 있습니다. 따라서 두 방식이 같은 기간 동안 동일한 체중 감량 효과를 보였다는 것은 단편적인 정보일 뿐이며 이러한 제한적인 데이터를 바탕으로 다이어트 방법의 효과를 비교하고 평가하는 데는 한계가 있습니다. 둘째, 실생활에서의 적용 가능성을 고려하지 않았다는 점입니다. 실험 환경에서는 철저한 통제가 이루어지지만 현실에서는 식단을 얼마나 지속할 수 있는지, 식욕 조절이 가능한지에 따라 결과가 크게 달라집니다. 따라서 단순히 감량 수치만이 아니라 신체적, 정신적 영향과 지속 가능성을 종합적으로 고려해야 합니다. 예를 들어 같은 칼로리를 섭취한다고 가정했을 때 하루 종일 조금씩 자주 먹는 방식과 한 번에 몰아서 먹는 방식 중 어떤 것이 더 지속 가능할까요? 대부분의 사람들은 공복 시간을 충분히 확보한 후 한 번의 식사에서 만족스럽게 먹는 방식이 훨씬 실천하기 쉽습니다. 게다가 충분한 공복 시간은 인슐린과 식욕 조절 호르몬을 정상화하여 음식에 대한 갈망을 줄이고 배고픔을 보다 효과적으로 조절할 수 있게 해줍니다. 이후 인터뷰에서 벤 비크먼 박사는 자신의 연구와 이론을 실생활에서 어떻게 적용하고 있는지 구체적인 예시를 들어 설명합니다. 이 부분은 매우 중요한데요. 그는 단순히 학문적인 연구만 하는 교수가 아니라 자신이 연구한 내용을 직접 실천하며 실제 생활에서 마주하게 되는 현실적인 문제들을 깊이 이해하고 있는 실천가입니다. 그가 이렇게 깊이 있는 지식을 일반인들도 공감할 수 있도록 쉽게 전달할 수 있는 이유가 바로 여기에 있다고 생각합니다.
So what would your suggestion be to the person that is still wants to have carbohydrates? Maybe they want to have 100 grams of carbohydrates a day and they're moderately active, they recreationally work out. We'll kind of end on this so there's a takeaway.
Yeah.
Like, what would you suggest? Periodic fasting, keeping, like, what would your sort of playbook be for that person?
Yeah. So just as a reminder, my kind of three pillars are control carbs, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And with control carbs, it is first for a reason because I consider it the most important. You, as much as possible, you'd want those 100 grams of carbs to not be coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. You'd want them to be whole fruits and vegetables. And the difference with the whole fruit and vegetable as opposed to the processed starches and sugars is the presence of fiber. So focus on fiber. If you're eating digestible carbohydrate, very likely nature has a fiber that's coming with it. And that's by design, and that's how we should take it. But still, if it's the 100 grams, I would say you want to get that not for supper. Not for the last meal of the day, because you do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic. Hyperglycemia stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm convinced one of the main reasons most people sleep so poorly these days, and I'm sympathetic to that, I'm inherently a bad sleeper, a lot of it is because they spike their glucose before they go to bed, because that's when most people indulge in starchy and sugary snacks. And then they have activated their sympathetic nervous system, so their body temperature climbs and their heart rate goes up and it's beating harder. And so they're lying in bed wondering why they can't fall asleep and wondering what they're anxious about. They're not anxious about anything. You just are hyperglycemic, and that activated your sympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight response. So you want to give yourself abundant time to get back to normal glycemia before you go to bed. So my advice always is load up lunch. Let lunch be the biggest meal, especially if a person is not inclined to have breakfast. Even though if you are a breakfast eater and that's when you find you're the hungriest, then you could load up those carbs for breakfast then. But lunch is a good way to do it. For me personally, I'm my late 40s. I don't have a lot going for me physically, and so I got to do what I can to stay fit, right? It's part of my marriage contract for my darling wife that I'm just going to do what I can to stay fit. But I want to be a healthy grandpa, of course. That's very much an interest for me. And I'm worried about some chronic diseases. And so I'm unapologetically an advocate of ketones, at least for some time of the day. If a person can have some brief period of ketones, that is going to be so helpful for brain health. And of all the diseases that scare me, Alzheimer's is probably the one that scares me the most.
Ditto, yeah.
Yeah, and especially for me, my brain is my moneymaker. Like, this is how I make my living. And so I need it to be really sharp. Study after study has shown that the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain a break from relying on glucose and allow it to consume ketones, which it does incredibly readily. This is, as a brief tangent, this is one of the things I disabuse my students of so often. They've been taught that the brain prefers glucose. That is absolutely false. Even if you have a body that has, say, 5 millimolar glucose and only 2 millimolar ketones, which is very achievable with a fast, the brain is already getting about 70% of its energy from those ketones. So even when the ketones are at half the level of the glucose, the ketones are already providing 2 to 3 times more energy to the brain than the glucose is. So the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain some ketones, and to do that, I fast through breakfast almost all the time, which is not so hard. I'm not generally very hungry, and it doesn't change the dynamic in my family. I'm married, I got kids. I don't want my kids to be looking across the table at dad wondering why dad's not eating. That's weird. And so I never fast through dinner. That's my one kind of cardinal rule. I have dinner with my family. If there's a way for me to keep it kind of low carb, and my wife generally sees this the way I do, so it's not too hard, then I do. But if my daughter wanted pizza for her birthday, we literally just celebrated her birthday yesterday when we recorded this, I'm going to eat pizza with my daughter. I'm not going to make it weird. So dinner is whatever the family's having. My lunch is generally, but if I'm going to load up my carbs, I would do it for lunch. All things equal, if I could, I'd load it up at lunch. And then breakfast, I generally am just fasting through anyway. So if you're going to take those 100 grams of carbs, I'd say focus on lunch as much as you can, given the social constraints that some people may have and given their natural habits. But at all costs, try not to get those carbs within 3 to 4 hours or so of going to bed. You just do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic.
깊은 과학적 통찰을 가진 그도 실생활에서는 의외로 평범하다는 느낌이 들죠. 저는 비크먼 박사의 진솔한 이야기를 통해 여러분이 많은 걸 느끼셨으면 좋겠습니다. 이론과 현실은 다를 수 있습니다. 식사는 단순히 음식을 섭취하는 행위가 아니라 가족과의 유대를 형성하고 주변 사람들과 더 가까워질 수 있는 중요한 매개체이기도 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 식생활을 건강이라는 한 가지 측면으로만 접근하는 것은 바람직하지 않습니다. 비크먼 박사는 피자가 건강에 어떤 영향을 미치는지 누구보다 잘 알고 있겠지만 딸의 생일을 축하하기 위해 기꺼이 함께 피자를 먹습니다. 여러분도 사회생활을 하거나 가족과의 식사 자리가 다이어트에 방해가 된다고 느낄 때가 있을 것입니다. 하지만 우리는 혼자 사는 것이 아닌 이상 이런 현실과 계속 부딪힐 수밖에 없습니다. 완벽한 식단을 유지하기란 불가능하다는 사실을 받아들이면 계획한 대로 식사를 하지 못했을 때 받는 스트레스도 크게 줄일 수 있습니다. 건강을 유지하면서도 현실적인 문제와 적절한 균형점을 찾아가는 것은 각자의 숙제입니다. 단호한 거절이 필요할 때도 있고 때로는 마음껏 즐기는 여유도 필요하겠죠. 이런 기준점은 다양한 상황을 겪고 고민하고 시행착오를 거치면서 자연스럽게 형성될 것입니다. 개인적으로 비크먼 박사의 영상 번역은 지금까지 가장 어려운 작업이었지만 동시에 가장 많은 것을 배울 수 있었던 인터뷰였습니다. 여러분도 유익한 시간이 되셨길 바랍니다. 비크먼 박사는 현재도 유튜브에서 활발히 활동하고 있습니다. 그의 강의 영상은 유튜브 검색창에서 벤 비크먼 또는 인슐린 IQ를 검색하시면 확인하실 수 있습니다. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.